My daughter, 21, is pregnant by the 36-year-old I raised. It's funny how a single Sunday dinner can shatter a lifetime. One moment, you're passing the mashed potatoes, listening to your wife laugh about something one of your sons said, and the next, the world tilts on its axis so violently you forget which way is up. For us, that moment came on a perfectly ordinary Sunday evening. My wife, who is 55, and I, at 58, were sitting at the dining table we'd had for 30 years. Our two sons were there, and so was our daughter, our youngest, who at 21 had just graduated from college and moved into her own place last fall. It felt good to have everyone together. And then there was Jackson. Jackson, who at 36, had been a fixture at this table since he was a teenager. To understand the depth of the wound, you have to understand who Jackson was to us. He wasn't just a family friend. Back in 2001, when he was just 16, his parents, our dearest friends, died in a car accident that felt like a punch to the gut of our entire community. He had no one else. So without a second thought, we took him in. He lived in our home for over 4 years, finishing high school, finding his footing. He was the older brother my kids never had, another son to my wife and me. We loved him. When he was ready to start his own life, we gave him a significant amount of money to launch a business, a gift given from the heart. We never expected anything in return. We were just proud. That business is now wildly successful, and we always saw his success as a part of our family story, a testament to resilience. He was one of ours. So, that Sunday, when my daughter cleared her throat and made an announcement, we all leaned in, expecting to hear about a promotion or some other exciting news from her new post-grad life. She was beaming, looking over at Jackson with a kind of adoration that felt off. And then she said it. The words that hung in the air like poison. She and Jackson were engaged. Engaged. The silence that followed was so thick I could feel in my throat. My fork clattered onto my plate. My wife's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. My sons just stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and disgust. But the second blow came immediately after. This wasn't new. They hadn't just fallen in love. They had been secretly dating for 3 years. 3 years. The math was sickening. She was 21 now, which meant it started when she was 18. He would have been 33. The boy we raised, the man who was for all intents and purposes her older brother, had started a relationship with her the moment she was legally an adult. For 3 years, they had sat at this very table, week after week, lying to our faces. They had gone on family vacations, celebrated holidays, and maintained a fiction while carrying on a secret that was a fundamental betrayal of everything our family stood for. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. The lies, the secret meetings, the carefully constructed facade. It was a conspiracy against us, carried out by two people we loved and trusted implicitly. The age gap, a full 15 years, was disturbing on its own. But the context made it monstrous. He wasn't some stranger she met at college. He was family. He had babysat her. He had changed her diapers. He had been a constant, paternal presence in her life since she was a toddler. My mind was reeling, trying to process the timeline. When she was 1 year old, he was 16, living in our house, grieving the loss of his own parents. We gave him a family, and this is how he repaid us. The anger came on like a tidal wave, hot and absolute. I looked from my daughter's defiant face to Jackson's, who couldn't even meet my eye. He just stared at his plate, the successful businessman suddenly looking like the guilty teenager he once was. I told them both, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years, that I did not approve. That this relationship was sick and wrong. I told Jackson he was no longer welcome in my home, the home he had opened to him when he had nowhere else to go. Then I looked at my daughter, my little girl, and told her that as long as she continued this relationship, she wasn't welcome either. The words felt like acid in my mouth. But in that moment of pure, white-hot betrayal, I couldn't see any other way. We had been blindsided, made fools of. The dinner ended in chaos. My wife was sobbing. My sons were shouting. And my daughter just stood there, holding Jackson's hand, looking at us as if we were the ones who had done something wrong. It wasn't until later, after they had left and the house was quiet except for my wife's heartbroken sobs, that the cold reality began to sink in. Banning my daughter from my home was a mistake. It was a knee-jerk reaction born from pain, but it was the wrong one. Alienating her would only push her further into his arms, isolating her and making her more dependent on him. That was the last thing I wanted. I felt disgusted, furious, and utterly powerless. I wanted the relationship to end immediately, but I couldn't lose my daughter. I had to find a way to get through to her, to make her see the danger she was in, to understand that this wasn't a fairy tale romance, but a predatory, disturbing dynamic that had been cultivated over years. I needed to do it without driving her away for good. I needed to save her, but I had no idea how. The days following that disastrous Sunday dinner were a blur of hushed, frantic conversations with my wife and sons. We were a family in crisis, reeling from a betrayal that felt impossible to comprehend. The initial shock slowly gave way to a gnawing, sickening need for answers. How could this have happened right under our noses? We decided we needed to talk to our daughter alone. Pushing her away had been my first gut-wrenching mistake, and I knew I had to correct it. We waited until the following Saturday, a day we knew Jackson worked from morning till night. My wife and I drove to our daughter's new apartment, the one we were still helping to pay for, and the irony was not lost on me. My heart hammered against my ribs as we walked up to her door. What would we say? How could we even begin to unravel this knot of lies and deceit? I started with an apology. I told her that my initial reaction, the anger and the ultimatum, was wrong. I explained that it came from a place of fear and shock, and that my primary concern, above all else, was her safety and her well-being. I needed her to know that, no matter what, we were her parents and we loved her. She let us in, her expression guarded. We sat on the couch in her small living room, the three of us in a tense triangle of unspoken accusations and deep familial pain. We talked for hours, and, as the conversation unfolded, things she said began to set off alarms in my head, each one a flashing red light of wrongness. One of the first things she told us, and perhaps the most chilling, was when her feelings for him began. She said, with a strange, sort of dreamy nostalgia, that she knew she loved Jackson since she was 14 years old. 14. My mind immediately did the math. If she was 14, Jackson would have been 29. A grown man. He was living on his own, running his successful business, and still coming to our house for weekly dinners, still a part of the family. The idea of him, at 29, seeing our 14-year-old daughter in that way was vile. She insisted, of course, that nothing physical ever happened until she was over 18. But how could I believe that? How could anyone believe that? This wasn't some innocent crush. This was a long-term grooming process, a careful, patient cultivation of a young girl's affections by a man who held a position of immense trust and authority in her life. Since their engagement had become public knowledge, a dam of silence among our extended family and friends had broken. People who had seen odd things over the years, things that seemed innocent or awkward at the time, were now calling us, their voices filled with concern. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to fall into place. My wife's sister called, her voice trembling. She recounted time a few years back when my daughter was 16. She, one of my sons, and Jackson were staying over at her house. My sister-in-law remembered hearing Jackson leaving our daughter's room early in the morning. At the time, she dismissed it. Kids fall asleep in each other's rooms all the time after watching movies, she thought. It was a house full of cousins and siblings. It seemed innocuous. But now, that memory was sinister. 31, I thought, the number echoing in my skull. A man of 31 and a girl of 16. My son then piped up, adding another piece to the mosaic of deceit. He told me about a time when our daughter was 15. He'd been cutting through town after school and ran into her in Jackson, laughing together outside a coffee shop. She was supposed to be in class. When he confronted her later, she'd spun a story about a half day and a doctor's appointment, and Jackson had backed her up. At the time, my son just thought she was playing hooky and was annoyed she'd dragged Jackson into it. Now it was clear. It wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern. They were sneaking around, right in broad daylight. We asked her what she loved so much about him, trying to understand what she saw in this man who was old enough to be her father. She gave us a list of generic compliments. He was kind. He was funny. He listened to her. But then she said something that made the hair on my arm stand up. She talked about how generous and caring he had always been, specifically to her. She told us how, for birthdays and holidays, he would give her the family gift in front of us, and then later, in private, he would give her another, much more expensive and personal gift. He told her was because she was always overshadowed by her brothers and deserved extra attention, special treatment that she didn't get from my wife and me. My wife flinched as if she'd been struck. The implication was clear. He had been systematically positioning us as the neglectful parents and himself as her true confidant, her savior. He was poisoning her against us, isolating her emotionally, making her feel like he was the only one who truly saw her. It was grooming, textbook, and insidious, and my daughter was presenting it to us as evidence of his profound love. The decision to keep the relationship a secret, she claimed, was mutual. The reason? Money. They knew that if we found out, we would immediately stop paying for her apartment and her college tuition. So they waited. They waited until she had her degree, until she was financially independent enough to withstand the fallout. The cold, calculating nature of it was stunning. This wasn't a whirlwind romance that got out of hand. This was a long-term strategic plan. She admitted that his friends, men his age, knew about the relationship from the beginning. But they didn't tell her friends, she said, because they didn't think it was right to ask them to lie to us. The hypocrisy was staggering. It was fine for them to lie, for his adult friends to be complicit, but her teenage friends were off limits. It was another layer of control, ensuring that no one her own age, no one who might have questioned the dynamic, could intervene. My wife, her voice barely a whisper, asked her if she ever felt guilty. If, during those 3 years of weekly family dinners, sitting across the table from us, pretending to be nothing more than siblings, she ever felt a pang of remorse. Our daughter had even invented fake boyfriends she was supposedly dating at college, going so far as to post pictures with a male friend on social media, telling us he was the one. She looked down at her hands. I felt guilty about lying, she admitted. But Jackson told me it would all be worth it in the long run. Every answer she gave us led back to him. Every justification was a line he had fed her. She was speaking his words, defending his actions, trapped in a narrative he had spent years carefully constructing for her. I suggested family therapy, gently. I told her it wasn't about blame, but about healing, about understanding how we got to this place. She flatly refused. She said she didn't need it, but she did have a request. She wanted me to speak with Jackson. She thought if we could just talk man to man, I would understand. I told her that was not going to happen. There was nothing that man could say to me that I wanted to hear. As we left her apartment that day, I felt a sliver of hope mixed with a much larger dose of terror. I had reopened the door, but I had also gotten a terrifying look inside her reality. She wasn't just in a relationship with him. She was under his spell. More stories trickled in over the next few days, each one another shovelful of dirt on the grave of the man I thought Jackson was. My niece, who is the same age as my daughter, called me. She told me about the times my wife and I would go out for the evening, leaving the kids at home. Jackson, who by then had his own place, would often come over to hang out. She recalled multiple instances where my daughter and Jackson would be cuddled up together on the couch under a blanket, watching a movie. It was a level of physical intimacy that never, ever happened when my wife and I were home. He knew exactly what lines not to cross in front of us. My niece also confirmed that when my daughter had friends over for parties while we were out of town, Jackson, the responsible adult, would be the one supplying them all with alcohol. He wasn't their supervisor. He was their co-conspirator, blurring the lines between adult authority figure and peer. My middle son, whose bedroom was on the ground floor, remembered being woken up late at night on several occasions by noises downstairs. A few times, he'd seen Jackson leaving our house in the early hours of the morning, long after he'd officially moved out. When my son asked him what he was doing there, Jackson would have a smooth excuse ready. He'd left a jacket. He needed to pick up some old mail. It would have been when my daughter was between 15 and 18. He had been sneaking into our house, into her room, while we slept just one floor above. The audacity, the sheer, stomach-turning arrogance of it, left me breathless. The final, gut-wrenching story came from my own brother. He told me about a family vacation we'd all taken together. My daughter was 15. One evening, Jackson had a bit too much to drink. My brother overheard him talking to my daughter, and he called her princess. At the time, my brother assumed it was in that teasing, big brotherly way, almost like an insult. But he said the tone was off. It wasn't teasing. It was soft, flirtatious. A pet name. He was calling my 15-year-old daughter princess in the same way a man calls his lover. All these little puzzle pieces, these seemingly innocent moments, now snapped together to form a monstrous, predatory picture. Jackson hadn't just fallen for my daughter when she turned 18. He had been preying on her for years, grooming her, isolating her, and violating the sacred trust our entire family had placed in him. He used our home as his hunting ground. My wife and I were at a loss. We felt like we were fighting a ghost. Jackson was a master manipulator, and he had convinced our daughter that his predation was a grand romance. We talked about going to the police, but what could we prove? My daughter was now a consenting adult, and she would defend him fiercely. Any legal action would be she said, battle that would only traumatize her further and drive a permanent wedge between us. We felt completely and utterly trapped. We continued to see our daughter, inviting her over for dinner, just her. The meals were strained, polite affairs, the elephant in the room, so large it barely left space for us at the table. We avoided talking about Jackson, focusing instead on her work, her friends, her life. We were trying to rebuild the bridge, hoping that if we kept the connection strong, she would eventually find her way back to us, back to reality. But we could feel him, his influence in everything she said and did. The breaking point came about a month later. My daughter came over for dinner one Tuesday night. She looked pale and tired. She picked at her food, unusually quiet. My wife and I exchanged worried glances. Finally, my wife asked her if she was feeling all right. My daughter pushed her plate away, took a deep breath, and her eyes filled with tears. "There's something I have to tell you," she whispered. "It's the real reason we told you about the engagement when we did." My heart seized in my chest. I braced myself for another horrifying revelation, though I couldn't imagine what could be worse than what we already knew. I was wrong. "I'm pregnant," she said, the words barely audible. "I'm 16 weeks pregnant." The room went silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a drumbeat of doom. 16 weeks. She was already 4 months along. This wasn't a possibility for the future. This was a reality growing inside her. A child, a grandchild, Jackson's child. In that moment, I understood the true meaning of checkmate. He had won. This was his final, unbreakable move. A baby would tie our daughter to him forever. It would tie us to him forever. The engagement, the announcement, it was all a preamble. They hadn't come clean out of a sudden burst of honesty. They had been forced to because a baby was coming, and that was a secret they couldn't keep. All the fight went out of me. The anger, the strategies, the desperate hope that we could somehow rescue her. It all evaporated, replaced by a profound, hollow sense of defeat. This was no longer about winning a battle for our daughter's autonomy. It was about the health and well-being of that same daughter and the innocent child she was carrying. To continue fighting, to pursue charges, to maintain a hostile front would be to subject her to unimaginable stress during her pregnancy. We would be punishing her, and by extension, our grandchild, for the sins of the man who had manipulated her. My wife and I held each other and cried that night, mourning the daughter we had lost and the family we used to be. The next day, we told her that we would be there for her. We made it clear that we still found the relationship inappropriate, that we were devastated and furious about when and how it began, but that we would be supportive. We told her our door would always be open to her, unconditionally. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, swallowing my rage and my disgust for the sake of my child. Our daughter was relieved, but her relief came with a condition. She made it clear that she did not want any animosity or hostile feelings regarding her fiancé. She wanted a united family. She wanted us to accept him. My sons did not take the news well. For them, the betrayal was just as raw, and the idea of welcoming Jackson back into the fold as their brother-in-law was unthinkable. The weekend after the pregnancy reveal, my oldest son went to see Jackson. I don't know what was said, but it ended in a physical altercation. My son, a man who had looked up to Jackson his entire life, finally let out all the rage and betrayal that had been simmering for weeks. It was a messy, ugly affair, but in a strange way, it was a necessary one. After that, a tense truce was called. All parties agreed, for the sake of my daughter and her baby, to behave amicably. We are a family walking on eggshells, pretending for the sake of a future that feels like a prison sentence. We will be grandparents to this child. Jackson, the boy I raised as my own, will be its father. He will be at every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering for the rest of our lives. He stands as a permanent fixture in our family, a monument to our failure to protect our daughter from the monster we invited into our home. We chose to be supportive, to keep our daughter in our lives, but every time I look at him, I see the depth of his betrayal, and I know that our family will never truly be whole again. He didn't just steal our daughter. He stole our past, and he has poisoned our future. All we can do now is stand by and pray that one day she will see him for who he truly is. And when that day comes, we'll be there to pick up the pieces,